Hello guys, welcome to another video. In this video, we would be discussing about concurrency and version as well as aliases, these three in Lambda, AWS Lambda. So what is concurrency? Like if you just check the definition of the concurrency, the number of requests a Lambda can simultaneously handle. And firstly, we should understand why did we come up with this concurrency concept. So there is a capping in AWS that in one specific account, we can't have more than 1,000 lambdas running at a time. So max to max in one account, 1,000 lambdas can run at a time. So let's assume we have multiple lambda functions, okay, and there is one lambda which goes high priority. So for suppose if it is triggered, it has to run. We can't make it wait and all. So in that case, let's take there are three lambdas and one lambda is like high priority. And let's assume as we have three lambdas, let's assume we are getting 400, 400, 400. So total of 1200 requests, which is beyond our 1000 capacity. What if that specific lambda which is high priority needs to take up this 400 request and run? We can't skip that because the maximum is 1000, but we are getting 1200 requests at a time here because for these three lambdas. So in that case, we can reserve that specific lambda by giving a 400, so that all this 400 requests will come to that lambda and it will trigger. And as the capping is 1000, the remaining concurrency limit is 600. So the others 600 out of the 800, the 600 requests will only be executed between the remaining two lambdas. But the first lambda will have the which is important lambda will have the 400 requests come to it and it executes. But the other two lambdas, as it's not highly prior, out of those 800 only 600 gets executed. So that's why we need this concurrency concept and all. So if you see, if the first phase is the init phase, in this phase it kind of sets up the runtime and loads the code, and invoke phase is where the lambda handler method is being executed. So now if you see, the number of requests lambda handles simultaneously is called concurrency, and we can control this kind of concurrency. There are two types of concurrency. One is reserved concurrency and the next is provisioned concurrency. Provisioned concurrency is little costly, where we will avoid this init step. For the low latency kind of lambdas, we avoid this init step, and the code deployment and everything, it's kind of ready. And it costs a little extra. Like it is used for the scenarios where we have API calls and web apps and all those things. So if you see, to eliminate the cold start by pre-warming the running environment. So it doesn't have to do this init step. That means it doesn't have to spin up the runtime and load the code. It will just invoke it. If you enable this provisioned concurrency for that specific lambda. And the first is a reserved concurrency. For suppose if you have multiple lambda functions, and if you want a specific lambda function to run it more frequently, like if you have a use case where you have specific lambda function runs more frequently than other lambda function, then you can reserve some kind of concurrency to that specific lambda. So now if you go to the code, and now if you come to configurations, and if you come to this concurrency and recursion detection, if you see, this is the concurrency. See, I mean, mine is a basic account, so I can't edit it with any number we want. But in case if you want to reserve concurrency, then you can just edit this number here. You can keep it to 900. Like by default, each account gets 1000 and the maximum concurrency, and you can reserve up to 900. Like you have to leave minimum of 100 as per the AWS rule. That's what the purpose of reserved concurrency. We can reserve that concurrency and make sure that lambda runs those many times per second. And if for suppose let's assume we gave it as 800, and if we get 820 requests in 1 second for this specific lambda, we get an throttle error. It won't run because the maximum concurrency we have set for this is 800 only. So for the lambda which runs many number of times repeatedly, then we have to go with this reserved concurrency, and we can reserve that lambda to run those many number of times. That's an high level explanation about reserved concurrency. Now we can even give the provision concurrency. So what exactly is a provision concurrency? Like as I said before, we can avoid the init step. So if we go to this documentation, we can avoid this step. Like the lambda will be ready with this runtime, and it loads the code. It will just directly trigger the lambda handler code. We can avoid the initial setup step. But to do this provision concurrency, we need to have the alias and version. Any one needs to be selected, and we have to give the number, how many of the provision concurrency we need. But it charges differently, and it will be extra charge, not just lambda trigger charge. So now what exactly is the version and alias? So let's go and check. So I hope you understand what exactly is the concurrency here. Just giving our lambda kind of high availability to trigger when compared with other lambdas. Because this lambda gets triggered more number of times, so we are giving it, we are reserving the concurrency for this lambda. That's on a high level. And provision concurrency is like avoiding the init step. So now if we go to aliases, first let's go to versions. We tag versions in aliases. So let's assume this is my piece of code. So what is my first piece of code doing? It will just print some hello world from lambda. So let's say I'll just make it as env equal to prod here. Okay, I'm just saying hello lambda env. So I'm just deploying it. Now let's assume I want this lambda to be a specific version. Like we know versioning, right? Like there can be multiple versions of the code. One version for prod, one version for dev, one version for UAT, something like that. So I want this particular code to be a prod version. So I just deployed this code, and now if I come to version, and if I do publish new version, then I can just give like prod version and publish. So this particular version will be a prod. Again, the same lambda can be created with another version 2 as well. You know, if you see, before it was just lambda concurrency, it is lambda concurrency :1. So if you run this particular lambda now, if you see here, we got hello lambda from prod. This is a version 1. So now let's go and create the version 2 as well. So now if I come to code, here I give dev, and now I'll deploy the code, and now if I come to versions, we already have one version. So now let's create this dev code also with another version. So now if I click on publish new version, I'll say dev version publish. See, now you see there are two versions in one lambda. So one for dev, one for prod. We can use the prod version for prod runs, dev version for the dev runs. So now in the same lambda, we have two versions. One is for the dev code and one is for the test prod code. So that is how we can use the same lambda in multiple versions. So dev and prod separately. So now we understand the version. So if you just define what exactly the version, it's just like point in time or a snapshot of your lambda at that point in time. That's what we can call. We can just call it as a snapshot of our lambda at that point in time. Like one snapshot for dev, one snapshot for prod. So if you see, this is 2, which is for dev. So now what exactly is alias? So with version, every time we have to create a new code and deploy the new version, right? So what if we want to run a specific version only? That's where we go with aliases. So now if I go to aliases, if I create alias, now dev alias, I don't need to give spaces, and now dev alias, I'm pointing to 2 version. And now if you see what is weighted alias here, so for suppose let's assume there are 2 versions and 50% of the traffic has to go to the first version and the 50% of the traffic has to go to the second version, something like that, then we can use weighted alias. But for now we'll just leave it and we'll just save it. So now if you see inside lambda, we have another lambda with alias dev alias. So now we can run it and we'll get the output as dev here, hello from lambda dev. See, now we can, so now with this dev alias, we are able to trigger the dev code. So now we can even run the prod code as well. So now if I go back here and if I come here and if I click here, edit, see, instead I'll just select the first version. So now the name will be dev alias, but it will run the prod code. So now if I click on dev alias, it should run the prod code. See, it's prod. So using alias, we can run any specific version or any kind of version we want. So the version is kind of a snapshot of our code. Like in one Lambda, we can maintain a multiple snapshot. And if we want to run a specific version, then we come to alias and we create the alias and then tag that to a specific version and run it. And why I have showed you all this is because in the concurrencies, when you want to provision the concurrency, we have to, we do need this alias and versions. We have to do that with specific version only. So I mean here in the we are just provisioning the Lambda to that specific version or alias, so that the init phase of our Lambda can be skipped, but it costs more than normal. And the second option is reserved concurrency. I mean, as I said, if we have a scenario where a specific Lambda gets triggered multiple number of times, we can reserve that Lambda so that it will have the capacity to run. I mean, it doesn't have to wait in the queue. We are giving the more kind of resources to that specific Lambda to run. That's it. Thank you so much for watching.